How and Edna Korth chose a life most people wouldn't survive, a life in Alaska's brutal, unforgiving wilderness. For over 40 years, they've depended on their skills, instincts, and each other to survive some of the harshest conditions on Earth. But their journey hasn't been just about resilience, it's also been marked by deep heartbreak. Behind the stunning landscapes and self-sufficient lifestyle lies a story of unimaginable loss. What tragedy nearly broke them, and why, after everything, do they still refuse to leave the land that has given them so much yet taken even more? To truly understand what we're about to uncover, we need to go back to where it all began. How and Edna are a rare breed, true off-the-grid survivalists living deep in Alaska's Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. It's one of the most remote places on Earth, and hardly anybody lives there. In fact, the Korths are among the last to do it the old way, relying entirely on the land to survive. But Heimo Korth wasn't born into this life. He came from Appleton, Wisconsin, a town that, while not massive, was still way bigger than Fairbanks and Juneau combined at the time. His parents, Eric and Irene, weren't outdoorsy. Even though his dad had grown up on a farm, he never learned to hunt, trap, or fish. Instead, he worked in a factory, providing a steady, predictable life. Heimo tried that life too, working in a factory back in Wisconsin, but it wasn't for him. He had always felt drawn to the wild. Even as a kid growing up in the suburbs, while other kids ran toward town, he did the opposite. Just a short walk away, there were open fields and woods waiting to be explored. Most of the time, he went alone, not because he had to, but because nobody else seemed to share his love for it. By the time he was a teenager, that pull toward the wilderness was too strong to ignore. In 1973, at just 18 years old, he set off for Canada's Northwest Territories, chasing his dream. But this was during the Vietnam War, and an 18-year-old heading north raised eyebrows. Many assumed he was dodging the draft, and people weren't exactly welcoming. Still, he was determined to carve out a place for himself in the wild. His first job was as an assistant to a hunting guide, but the pay was so bad he could barely afford rent and food. Eventually, he had no choice but to return to Wisconsin, but the wilderness never stopped calling him. Then he got a break, an opportunity in Alaska, working for a guide who hunted big game in the Brooks Range. He was 20 years old when he stepped into the wilderness for good, and he never came back. After working with a hunting guide for a while, he got hooked up with a friend who ran a trapping line in Alaska. This friend didn't just give him advice, he handed over supplies, food, traps, the whole setup, and flew him out to a remote cabin in the middle of nowhere. It was just Heimo and the wild. For 3 long months, he struggled to teach himself how to trap. He came close to starving, and if that wasn't bad enough, he fell through the ice on the river, losing almost everything he had. With no real way out, he wrote a letter to his old boss asking for help. To his surprise, his boss sent him a check for $500. That was just enough to get back to town and regroup. But something had shifted. The wilderness had a hold on him now. He knew this was the kind of life he wanted. He spent the rest of that first winter on St. Lawrence Island, a tiny Eskimo village way out in the Bering Sea, just 90 miles from Siberia. That's where he met Edna, though they didn't start dating right away. Now, Edna was born on January 25, 1954, as part of the Yupik people. Her native name is May Dunn. Growing up in the community meant knowing how to fish, hunt, and survive off the land. Her uncle, Jackson Mook, was a master at trapping foxes. He taught her everything: how to cut the furs without damaging them and how to take care of them after skinning. By then, Heimo had become like family. He was close with Edna's father, Emerson, and spent a lot of time with them. Jackson even took him under his wing, showing him the ins and outs of trapping and fur preparation. And it didn't take long for Jackson to notice that Heimo had a thing for Edna, especially when Jackson jokingly called Edna Howe's wife. But Howe wasn't trying to admit anything. Small towns have a way of making everything everybody's business, and he wasn't about to be at the center of the gossip mill. Heimo kept himself busy helping CS run the village store and learning to hunt from the best in town. When spring rolled around, he left for Beaver Creek, a river in the White Mountains near Fairbanks. A friend had a cabin out there and needed someone to look after their dogs for the summer. So Heimo packed up and headed back into the wild. For the next 2 winters, Howe was deep in the Brooks Range, a brutal stretch of mountains where survival was anything but easy. In Alaska, they call it hungry country for a reason. There just aren't many animals out there. Trapping was rough, food was scarce, and the cold was relentless. Deep snow and freezing temperatures, every single day was a battle. He might not have made a fortune, but those winters shaped him into a true mountain man. He proved without a doubt that he could not only survive but thrive in one of the harshest environments on Earth. After searching far and wide, Heimo finally found what he was looking for, a place along the Kolini River. This river, a smaller offshoot of the Porcupine River, was tucked away deep in Alaska's wilderness. He needed a spot where he could trap enough fur to make a living, but by the time he arrived, most of the best trapping grounds around the Yukon Flats were already claimed by other trappers. But his friend Bob had already been trapping there and invited Heimo to join him further upriver. So Heimo trekked about 50 miles upstream, not realizing he was stepping into the very place that would become his home for life. 3 years later, he made his way back to Songa, excited to see Edna again, but the moment he laid eyes on her, it hit him just how lonely he'd been without her all that time. For their first date, they kept it simple but unforgettable. They went fishing for Dolly Varden, took a motorcycle ride, and topped it off with pizza. By the late 1970s, Edna made the trip to Howe's cabin in the mountains. It was her first time seeing the place he had built, and she wasted no time pushing him to improve it. She told him he needed to start building a real home for her, though even she wasn't sure if it was the right move. But once she said it, she stuck to it, so Heimo got to work. He had no choice but to finish before winter. So for a solid week, he worked like a man possessed. Just as the first snowflakes started falling, he put the last piece in place. Heimo and Edna got married in 1982, and for most of the year, they had no running water, no electricity, and no connection to the outside world. Every fall, they hunted and trapped, stocking up enough to survive the long, brutal winters. Now, Edna's life had already seen its share of heartbreak. Before she met Heimo, she had been engaged to a Swedish biologist, and together they had 2 children, Melinda and Merlin. But tragedy struck when her fiancé died in a plane crash, leaving her alone to raise their children. It was a devastating loss, and the weight of single motherhood rested heavily on her shoulders. Her next relationship didn't bring much comfort either. Her uncle saw firsthand that the man she dated after wasn't good for her, unfaithful and unreliable. So when Heimo came into the picture, her uncle was cautious. He wanted to be sure this man was different, that he would treat Edna right. In time, Heimo proved himself. He adopted Melinda, though she only lived with them for part of the year. Most of the time, she stayed with Edna's parents in Savona, where she felt most at home. Merlin, Edna's son, lived with her parents full-time in Savona. It was common for children to be raised by grandparents or other relatives, but that didn't make it any easier for Edna. Leaving them behind, even for a few months, was painful. But deep down, she understood that her parents could give her children the stability she couldn't guarantee in the wilderness. For months after their wedding, Edna and Heimo welcomed their first daughter together, and they named her Colleen after the Colleen River. Colleen was like a little wildflower, full of life and curiosity. She spent summers picking blueberries, splashing in the river with Edna, and riding on Heimo's shoulders. But more than anything, she loved to explore. She had a habit of wandering off, so Edna sewed a little bell onto her coat to keep track of her. Every evening, as the family took their walks along the river, the sound of that tiny bell jingled with each step. She had a fascination with the moon too. Whenever it appeared in the sky, Heimo would lift her up so she could see it better, and she'd point with excitement, calling out, "Moo, moo." Then the unimaginable happened. Just 5 days after her second birthday, Colleen drowned in a river accident, and they never found her body. The grief was crushing. Friends and family urged the Korths to leave the bush, to start over somewhere else, but they couldn't. This was Colleen's home. Her laughter still echoed in the wind. Her little footprints were still in the dirt. Leaving would feel like abandoning her memory. That day, when they returned to their cabin, Heimo carved a wooden cross for her. He carefully etched her name and the dates of her short life into it. That fall, he and Edna carried the cross up a small mountain overlooking the valley and the river. They placed it there, a marker of their love and loss. Determined to honor their daughter, they tried to get the mountain named after her. They petitioned the Board of Geographic Names, but the response was cold. Colleen wasn't considered historically significant enough. Even with support from the governor and a congressman, they were repeatedly denied. They gathered signatures, did everything asked of them, but the answer remained the same. After a while, they had to let it go. But even in their sorrow, Heimo and Edna refused to let go of the life they had built. They were committed to the wilderness, to the land they had chosen. Heimo once put it in perspective: if a couple in Dallas lost a child in a car accident, would they move away just to escape the pain? No, because it was their home, and that's how he and Edna felt. Even decades later, they still got teary-eyed thinking about Colleen. The grief never really left, but they carried on. In time, they had 2 more daughters, Rhonda and Kren. They also created a family tradition. Every so often, they would make the journey up to the mountain to the place where they had planted Colleen's cross. Years passed, but the wilderness remained home. Heimo took pride in the life they had built, in keeping alive a way of living that had existed for thousands of years. What started as an adventure became simply the way they lived. Then, in 1992, Heimo Korth's life in the wild caught the public's attention when he appeared in Braving Alaska, a National Geographic special. At first, he wasn't sure about it. He worried the show might make his life in the mountains look bad. But in the end, he took a chance, and to his relief, he was happy with how it turned out. The documentary followed 4 families living deep in the Alaskan wilderness, and it was a rare chance to see a young Heimo, Edna, and their children back when they were just kids. Another family featured was the Haydens, who lived on the Cuss River. One of them, Susan Hayden, was just a teenager at the time, already running her dog team and trapping. Years later, she and her brother revisited their old home, and Susan even made a few appearances on the Last Alaskans. Fast forward to 2003, and Howe's cousin, James Campbell, a writer, sent him a letter with an idea. He wanted to write a book about Howe's life. At first, Heimo wasn't interested, but after some thought, he decided to give Campbell a chance. James made the long journey from Wisconsin to Alaska, spending an entire season with the Korth family. He lived the way they did, experiencing firsthand the brutal cold, the isolation, and the daily struggles of surviving in one of the harshest places on Earth. That experience turned into the 2004 book The Final Frontiersman, which told the story of Howe and his family's life in the wild. The book was a hit, well-written, gripping, and full of raw, real-life adventure. In 2009, Vice Media came knocking. They filmed Howe's Arctic Refuge, also known as Surviving Alone in Alaska, a documentary that gave an unfiltered look at Howe and Edna's life in the wilderness. It's the kind of film that pulls you in, not just because of the beautiful, unforgiving landscape, but because of the people living in it. Then came 2012, when Howe unexpectedly ended up on Flying Wild Alaska. All he wanted was a flight to Fairbanks, so he reached out to the show's star, who happened to be a pilot. Next thing he knew, he was on TV again. But it wasn't until 2015 that Heimo and his family truly became household names. That's when The Last Alaskans premiered on Animal Planet. The show followed a handful of families living in one of the most remote places in America, the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. It documented their struggles, their joys, and the way they carved out a life where most people wouldn't last a week. The show ran for 4 seasons, with a total of 36 episodes, and by the time it wrapped up in January 2019, it had built a loyal fan base. Viewers were fascinated by the different families, but there was no doubt, Howe and Edna Korth were the heart of it all. They weren't just surviving in the wild, they were thriving. Howe's passion for the Alaskan way of life was infectious. In the very first episode, he put it into words: "This is an adventure. This is joy. You're bound to nature. Nature directs your path." And that was the truth for them. Howe reportedly earned around $3,000 per episode of The Last Alaskans, but money was never the driving force. This was the life he and Edna had chosen, for better or worse. And the show didn't just capture the good times, it showed the heartbreak too, like when they lost their 2-year-old daughter Colleen in a canoeing accident. Most reality shows gloss over the tough stuff, but The Last Alaskans never shied away from the truth. Despite its success, the show was expensive to produce, and that's part of why it only lasted 4 seasons. But what made The Last Alaskans stand out was its authenticity. Unlike other Alaska-based reality shows that leaned into drama or exaggerated danger, this one stayed true to real life. There were no staged arguments, no one trying to get famous, just people living the way they always had. Some were born into it, carrying on generations-old traditions. Others had moved to Alaska, searching for solitude and purpose. In 2016, James Campbell revisited Howe's story in Braving It, this time bringing his daughter along to experience life at Howe's cabin. It was a fascinating look at how things had changed, or maybe how they hadn't. Years later, Howe and Edna's 3 daughters, Millie, Rhonda, and Kren, had all grown up and settled into their own lives in Fairbanks, far from the remote wilderness where they were raised. But it's clear that the wild still calls to them. Kren, the youngest, feels that pull the most. Now, she and her husband are planning to move closer to her parents, bringing their son Colby along for the adventure. Even with the distance, the family stays connected. The kids and grandkids still visit Howe and Edna at their remote cabin, and every summer, Howe and Edna make their way back to Fairbanks to spend time with them. But as soon as fall rolls around, they return to the only life they've ever truly known. Out there in the wild, Howe still makes a living the old-school way, running trap lines that stretch for hundreds of miles through the snow-covered wilderness. He rides a snowmobile across those vast frozen landscapes, tracking and trapping wolves, wolverines, foxes, martens, and beavers. The beaver meat makes for a good meal, and their fur is valuable. Among trappers, Heimo has a reputation as one of the best wolverine trappers in North America. Edna traps too, but she sticks closer to home, focusing on the essentials. She still sews their winter gear by hand, crafting How's heavy-duty parka and the thick gloves that protect him from the brutal cold. The years are adding up, and being so far from their family isn't always easy. But no matter what, How and Edna always return to the cabin when winter comes. That land, that life, it's in their blood. How, still strong and full of energy, says he hopes to spend the rest of his days out there, in the only place that's ever felt like home.